camera.
Should I hold my Tim Hortons cup?
Yeah, you should.
Like more Canadian? The first step to taking good Northern Lights photos is making sure that it's a clear night, so make sure you can see the stars. And also look at the Northern Lights forecast before you go out. But if you live in an area where there is Northern Lights, almost always you can see Northern Lights, especially with the camera. So you'll want to make sure when you're packing your gear that you have a tripod, a memory card with lots of space, and a full battery. And typically when I shoot Northern Lights photos, I like to bring a wider angle lens, but that's up to you. Bring what you prefer. You'll want to make sure you have lots of warm gear because you don't know how long you'll be out there for. And definitely bring a headlamp. Bring snacks.
Can I remove that hot chocolate and get 2 of the Earl Greys?
Snacks. When you're finding your location, make sure you find an area that faces north. This is because the solar flares are attracted to the magnetic poles of the north. And what happens is hydrogen and oxygen and other chemicals, but those are the main ones, interact with the little sun flares, and that's how you get all the colors. And yeah, make sure you drive away from all the city lights, otherwise it'll get a bit of a glow to your shots, and that doesn't always look the greatest. So sometimes you have to clear some trees out of the way so that you can get to where you're going. Oh. Okay, so before you go outside, because it's cold out, you want to save your fingers from getting cold. You want to have your focus ready. So depending on the lens you're using, some don't have it, but I would suggest using a lens that has the focus meter here. So there's the infinity loop. And if you're right on infinity, you won't see anything. So you'll want to go just above affinity. So for mine, it has like a line that connects, but it would be right before 2 on some cameras. I don't know if that makes any sense. Does that make some sense?
Absolutely, yes.
Did it make sense?
Yes.
Okay. You're gonna want to set your shutter speed to, I would start with 20 seconds. If you go any over 20 seconds, your stars will appear blurry. So start at 20 seconds. If your camera has the ability for you to shoot faster, I would go faster. So next for your aperture, I'm shooting wide open. So from my lens, it's f1.8. That way it can take in as much light as possible. Okay. So next for ISO, I'm gonna start with maybe 1600. ISO stands for image sensitivity or something like that. But depending on the camera that you're using, whether it's mirrorless or not, it will show noise if you're going at a really high ISO. So you kind of need to know your camera for that. But I would say if you're shooting on just a typical DSLR, then 1600 is a good starting place. And then check your white balance. If you have it on tungsten, it's just gonna come out better, but you can fix it all in post as long as you're shooting in RAW. I like to set a delayed timer of, usually it's 2 seconds or 3 seconds, but that way you can get your hand away from the camera after you click so that you don't have any shakes in it. It's cold. So, the northern lights are out, but there's a lot of clouds, which sucks, but it does kind of look cool. Do you want to point down? So, I have my camera set up, and because it's so windy, I put the legs out as far as possible so that the tripod could have as much stability. And when I'm taking the photos, I'm also standing to block the wind because I noticed that I was shaking the lens a little bit, which made the stars kind of blurry. But basically, all you really need to do once you have your camera set up, make sure you have your timer on, and you can click the shutter, and just wait and see what thing you can play with is, it's called light painting. So it's where you turn on your headlamp or use any kind of light. You can paint different parts of the foreground in with your light. When you do it, keep in mind that like one little burst of light is a lot of light if you're taking a photo for 20 seconds. So I would do it for like a second at most, or you can do multiple different exposures. So as long as you don't move your camera, you can take like 3 different shots and change the shutter speed for each one so it's exposed right. It takes a lot of playing around with, and if it's really cold, you might not have the patience to do that. Okay, so now that you've finished shooting your photos and hopefully you've had the chance to warm up, go ahead and import all your photos into Lightroom. And then I like to go through all my photos and just catalog them by giving them a star rating. So you can hit the 4 key or the 5 key, and that just gives your photos that you like a star rating, and then you can filter through it in your library afterwards. But yeah, so I went through all my photos and I decided I liked this photo the most, just because I felt like the people added a bit more of like a focal point to the photo. And also the foreground in this location was just pretty barren. So I like having a little bit more happening. So I didn't really go into composition that much, but looking back, I wish I'd tried playing with a bit more of a telephoto lens and then trying to just get this part of the photo in more. But I was really cold, so I kind of gave up. So this is what the original photo looks like. You can see some greens, there's a little bit of purples here, but because this is a raw image, it's very flat in terms of colors and shadows and stuff like that, but that's fine. We are going to make it look pretty. So first I'm going to start with just straightening this because it's driving me insane. So yeah, whenever there's like an obvious horizon line in your photo, just do everyone a favor and make sure it's straight. So I'm going to play with lifting the highlights a little bit, as well as the shadows. And the hardest part of Northern Lights photography is there's a lot of blues and greens in it. So it's really hard to find a good balance of not having too much blue and being able to differentiate the color of the light versus the background, like the sky. So first I'm just playing around in the basic settings, so playing with the highlights, shadows, the whites and blacks. But right now I'm just trying to achieve getting more contrast in the sky, but without making the highlights too bright. So next I'm going to go into the curves panel. And I'm just going to lift the curves in the center a little bit, because that's our midtones. And then bring down the shadows a bit more. I really want to make sure I can see the difference between the people here and the mountains. I don't really want them to blend together. And I like to lift the blacks just a little bit. I don't want to go too crazy in this photo. And then I'm going to play with the highlights over here. So I'm just going to bring them up the tiniest little bit. You don't want to go too overboard with lifting the highlights in Northern Lights photos because otherwise you're going to lose a lot of the color, and it's just going to look unnatural. Okay, so next I'm going down to the hue or the HSL panel, and I'm going to play with the hues. So there's a lot of aquas in this photo, and if you look at it, like this looks kind of unnatural to me, and I like it in the more on the green side. Next I'm going to play with the greens. So there's not a lot of greens changing, but I'm going to bring it more towards the yellow side. And then with the blues, because a lot of the blues live in like the clouds and the mountains, just to make a bigger difference between the color of the Northern Lights and the background, I'm going to make it more blue rather than turquoise. So next I'm just going to play with the saturation. I want to keep it natural, and I'm only going to play with the saturation, the greens, aquas, and blues. There's not really any colors in this photo aside from that. And then I like to come up here. So typically when I edit my photos, I like to lift the vibrance and then bring down the saturation, but I'm actually going to do the opposite. in this photo. So yeah, bringing down the vibrance and then bringing up the saturation just makes the light stand out a little bit more to me. And then I'm gonna go play with the luminance. So I wanna brighten the lights a little bit more. So I'm lifting the aquas just a little bit. I'm going to bring down the greens though. And then for blues, just gonna see what I like. I like them slightly lifted. I feel like I can see a little bit more of the northern lights when I do that. Noise reduction. There's a lot of noise in my photo, especially because we were shooting at a higher ISO. So I'm just gonna lift this ever so slightly. If you go overboard, your photo is gonna look like this weird smooth texture, and we do want to keep a good amount of texture in. Then I'm going to add some grain. I feel like grain just helps with the quality of the image, if that makes sense. So for the color grading, I just sped this up for time's sake, but I found that the greens looked nice in the midtones, and then bluish purples looked good in the shadows. And then for the highlights, I actually used kind of like a pinky red color, and that kind of helped bring out the purple and pinks that was in the northern lights that's sort of got lost in the photo. So next, I like to go in with a brush tool, and this is when you can get a lot more detailed with your edit. So double click on the effects little button here, and that just resets all your settings. So first I'm going to bring up the texture and clarity. I'm just going to brush it in the area where you can see stars. So that just brings out the stars a little bit more. And I'm finding this part here a bit distracting. Take the brush tool again and just bring down the highlights and just brush it in this area. Oops. Kind of randomly so that it looks a bit more natural, and that looks good to me. So next I want to add in the purple. So you can see here that there was purple there. It's just not very noticeable. So first I'm going to lift the highlights, and I'm going to go in and select a pinkish color. I'm going to make my brush pretty small. And then the way Northern Lights looks is kind of like these vertical streaks. So I'm just going to do a bunch of little vertical strokes sort of randomly. Yeah, and right now I have the color like a bit more prominent than what I would keep in my final edit. I just like to do that so that I can see it better. But you can also hit O and you can see it a little bit more. So now I'm just gonna bring down the saturation of that color. And then I'm going to take the brush tool again and do the same thing, but actually bring down the shadows and then go for a bit more of like a purpley color and add strokes again. And this is just going to create a little bit more depth and like contrast in the sky. Right about there. So now there's a little bit more purple happening, which I like. And next I just want to enhance kind of like the green and some of these little bands that you're seeing in the sky. So I'm going to take the brush tool again, bring up the highlights, and I'm going to zoom in a bit and just add little streaks and bands wherever I kind of feel like there should be a little bit more detail. Okay, so once I zoom out, you're like, oh my god, that is grossly noticeable. So I'm just going to bring it to about 9. If there's areas that look a little bit too harsh for you, you can always just go in and erase it. So next I'm going to do the same thing, but I'm going to add some shadows in. And this kind of just adds like a bit more contrast between the bands as well. You're honestly like painting it in kind of like you're contouring muscles on a body. That's like the best way I can describe what the process is like. So basically adding shadows and highlights to areas to make it more defined, like when I was there. And yeah, so that's starting to look really good. So the next thing I'm going to do is just make the mountains a little bit more noticeable. So I'm going to take the brush tool again and lift the highlights and the shadows and just paint it on the areas of the mountains that I want to stand out a little bit more. And just be careful about drawing outside of the lines, because then it'll just look fake. And yeah, so to me that looks good. And then the next part that I want to add in is when I was there in person, you could see the light of the northern lights reflecting off the snow on the lake here. So I'm just gonna, again, grab another brush. I'm gonna lift the highlights and just add the tiniest little bit of green in and kind of paint it in the areas where like I know that there is more of a reflection. And this looks really gross right now, but I'm going to fix that in a second. A bit more. And I'm just gonna lift the shadow slightly. And this looks very blotchy to me right now. So what I'm gonna do is go and take the eraser, lower the flow a lot, and add a lot of feathering to the brush. And then I'm just going to go in on any of like the harsh lines that I'm seeing to kind of create a bit of a gradient. And yeah, that looks good to me. And the last thing that I'd maybe add would just be a radial filter right here. I'm just going to bring down the exposure a little bit to create a bit more of like a focal point. And then same thing, just bring it down here a little bit. And that just helps bring your eye to the brightest part of the photo, being the northern light. And yeah, so for me, this looks pretty good. The only things that I'd maybe consider retouching a bit more is you can see that I was moving a little bit in this photo. So if you were really nitpicky, you could go into Photoshop and just like crisp up this line a little bit, but I'm not going to do that today because it doesn't bother me too much. So this is my final photo. I typically like to take like a little break from editing and then coming back and doing my final kind of touches to the photo. But for now, I'm happy with it. I think I might play with the stylization more. But yeah, so this is my final photo and I'd love to see what you guys shoot. So I hope you enjoyed the video and good luck with your photo.